Christmas!
And that's all that matters. At least
Merry
I scared the
Christmas!
bejeebers out of that little girl at the post office.
Merry
She'll be scarred
Christmas!
for life if we're lucky.
Merry Christmas! 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 Merry Christmas!
Must be afraid
Merry
of
Christmas.
idols.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Yes! Down the size of the hat! And this time, I'll keep it all. Get the stick! Get the stick!
Ho, ho, ho! Well, ho, ho, ho! Well, ho, ho, ho! Oh, oh, Merry Christmas!
Outside his cave.
Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas! Ho, ho,
I'm
ho!
barking.
Merry Christmas!
Hey, yeah!
Heard me mention who? I hate you. Hate, 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 hate. Double hate.
Loathe entirely.
Thus, the seeming novel existence of vampires was an undeniable test case for this rather modern theological stance. Could Catholic theology weather the problem of vampires? While conclusions varied among theologians, and several, including again a once and future pope, as I mentioned, would address the topic of vampires, the emergent position was that their physical resurrection simply didn't occur. They were not physically coming back from the dead. Their apparent post-mortem endurance was a natural effect of decomposition, and any spectral effects were either ultimately delusional or demonic vandalism. Maybe the demons could prevent them from decaying at some rate, but they didn't come back from the dead. As for the Protestants, if you're wondering, this vampire craze was basically a non-issue. It was all born of Popish or Eastern Orthodox superstition intermixed with a bunch of old peasant paganism. The Protestants didn't ever take any of this terribly seriously. In fact, Protestants just mock the Catholics for taking any of this into consideration in books. The fact that for the Protestants, the idea that Catholics were writing books about vampires was further proof of the stupidity of papistry. The philosophers, too, also were perplexed by the matter of the vampires. The Cambridge Platonists, especially More, took the resurrection of the vampire as actually lending possibility to strange survivals of the soul after normal death. He accepted the possibility they were coming back from the dead physically. Indeed, some of the final vestiges of historical Paracelsians actually lent their theories and not a little occult philosophy to explaining the sudden appearance of the vampires during the craze of the 1730s. In fact, Voltaire even seems to note, perhaps in frustration, that all anybody talked about in the 1730s was vampires. So, goth clubs, meet 1730s vampire salon discussion scene. In general, there were very active debates about the nature of life at this time, from the radical mechanists, people like the post-Cartesians with their sort of ghost in the machine theory, to various vitalists and even more occult theories still. Exactly what life was and when did it end was interesting at this time. It's interesting in our time. Are viruses alive? For the post-Cartesians, a vampire might be a test case, as if they held that human beings were different from other creatures and that they were machine bodies driven by conscious souls. We're machine bodies driven by conscious souls located infamously in our pineal gland. That's where your soul is, according to the Cartesians. Were the vampires human? Were they driven by thought and will, or were they mere mechanism driven like animals by their insatiable drive for blood, simply motivated, willful shells of former human beings? One might even imagine a movie in which some Cartesians set out from France into the wilds of Wallachia to capture a vampire, and then run tests on it to see if they can prove their philosophical convictions, whether they're really animals or humans. Or Andy, you watching this? This is I think it's a good Anton Shay film. Other philosophical positions held that the physical body of the resurrected vampire must be linked to the mystical body that roams about, attacking the living and somehow remotely draining their blood, even spreading their vampirism through some means of epidemic. This was a strange idea. How did they get the blood in their graves? But if one adopted a purely naturalistic theory, what explains the resurrection of these creatures? How could they come back to life after being dead? How could they be trapped in those tombs and still roam about? And if one rejects this, then how do you explain all the scores of apparently trustworthy reports flooding into Western Europe from the 1720s through the 1750s? With germ theory more than a century away, alchemy not yet extinct, and the new science in its infancy with radical opinions abounding about what could be going on here, the first major task of the Enlightenment, if you believe this, one of the first major tasks of the nascent Enlightenment was to deal with, of all things, the emergence of the vampire and its philosophical implications for everything from the Cambridge Platonists over there in England, early modern occult philosophers, the sort of early emergence of neo-occultism, and the twilight of Paracelsianism, to the radical positivists and the mechanists. Everybody had a dog in this fight, a vampire. In this fight, one even gets a taste of a first-hand report on the topic as the botanist de Tefort looks down his nose at the islanders of Mykonos as they seek out and destroy a dangerous, though not blood-sucking, southern European species of vampire, the Vrykolakas. His eyewitness account of the dissection of this creature makes for wonderful, gruesome reading, but definitely not at all for the squeamish. By around 1720, what began as bureaucratic military reports on recently occupied lands had become a topic of near universal interest through Europe. The vampire had really arrived in earnest. What developed was a feedback loop. Local military reports got the interest of regional doctors. Those lurid reports inspired conversations when published in fashionable salon journals, which prompted further investigation. Those investigations, of course, discovered more vampires, and this feedback loop in various places through Europe, reports of Eastern vampirism exploded through the 1750s, well after the military occupation of the region ended in 1738 or so. The vampire was simply here to stay. Of course, this logic is so structurally similar to the witch hunts, with credulous investigators and righteous vampire hunters next to the further credulous armchair theologians and philosophers way off over there in France. It's not hard to think of the vampire craze as a mutation of the witch craze. You had a preconceived notion of witches, you went and found them through torturing people. You had a preconceived notion of vampires, you found them once you exhumed graves and don't really understand what's going on in germ theory and decomposition. Recall that executions for witchcraft were still occurring in the late 18th century, with even a few spurious cases in the early 19th century in Prussia. They overlap in some sense, the witch craze and the vampire craze, and in this way I suspect that the witch and the vampire share some deep structural relations sociologically. They certainly were in the minds of the people at this time. Think of the witch as causing pestilence and the vampire causing pestilence. I think what happens here is people traded the witch for the vampire. These early military medical reports, reprinted in learned journals and fashionable journals, as I mentioned, would reach their culmination in Calmet's treatise on the apparitions of spirits and the vampires or revenants of Hungary, Moravia, etc. First published in 1746, but heavily updated in several editions, especially the vampire editions. He really updated the vampire editions. Here's a copy I have that's actually going to be for sale in my new catalog. In some sense, this is the definitive textbook on vampires of the period. The entire second half of the book is dedicated to vampires, and it's actually just one of the best collections of ghost stories as well. The whole first part's about ghosts and magic and demonic possessions and demons and things. It's fantastic. The priest scholar Calmet is, at least in the first edition, more open to the possibility of the reality of vampires as a kind of divine punishment. But as more reports come in, he becomes increasingly unconvinced and eventually rejects them as theologically impossible. God is not punishing people with this. At any rate, however, as he gets on, later he wrestles really with the range of possibilities concerning vampire accounts, and I would say that he struggles between a profound skepticism of this is possible to really being sympathetic to the accounts at his hand. He really takes them as seriously as possible. Voltaire mocks him for this. This dialectic creates a real tension in his work, making it read as much as a dissertation, frankly, as a kind of mystery novel with the more horrible potential outcomes. The reality of the living dead. A lot rests on this book, theologically, philosophically, monsterological. It's no wonder the book went into wide editions. It was widely popular. It went into numerous editions and was translated into several languages, including English. You can get the great English translation of 1850. The wide reach of this work was further cemented. The vampire and his dissertation became the foundation for the industry of vampire fiction that would emerge starting in the early 19th century, of course, including Dracula. Stoker certainly read this book, at least in the English translation. Of course, the vampire would not only be the last monster of the Enlightenment and modernity, that's probably biological, chemical, and atomic warfare, nor even the most dangerous, but in some sense, being the first monster of this period, it's no wonder that such creatures have had such enduring power in imagination, art, literature, film, lifestyle, frankly. The vampire's here to stay. The best and most accessible recent history of vampires is Nick Groom's work, which is vouched for by Ronald Hutton. So if you're around here, you know about Ronald Hutton. He's the GOAT. And that's a gold seal around here for sure. So pick up Groom's work. If you want to check out some of the earliest vampire accounts in translation, the absolute best test there is Barber's Vampires, Burial, and Death. Though I have to admit to you, some of the sections are at all not for the squeamish. If you're not a fan of body horror, you might want to read that one. The bibliography, however, is just great for just primary sources around vampire literature, although you need to learn to read some other languages. Speaking of which, if you read German, you can access many of the original documents in their original German, in Sturm und Wirkus von denen Vampiren. If you really want to get into the bureaucratic nature of those early military reports, then they hit different. and the original German. Of course, Calmet's on the apparitions of spirits and vampires remains an absolute classic. If you can get a reprint, make sure to get the expanded edition, like the later 1750s editions in French, or if you get the English edition, you can get the translation of 1850. That's the more complete edition. It's just an occult classic, and you need to have it on your shelf. It's far better, frankly, than Montague Summers' books on vampires. Summers just leans very heavily on Calmet, so just go back to Calmet. Although Montague Summers' books are quaint and wonderful in their own creepy little weird way. I only wish for myself there were a solid collection of the early vampire tracts in critical editions. To my knowledge, Romp's On the Chewing Dead doesn't have a modern academic edition. It may not even have a modern edition at all, which, if I'm correct, that's a real pity. I doubt I'm done with vampires. I'm sure I'm going to be interested in coming back to the more deep, more esoteric elements of how vampirism affected theology and philosophy at this time, and it gets us right up to the limit of where esoterica focuses, right up to the limit around the turn of the 1800s. So in that way, it's a kind of a wonderful bookend for the channel in a general way, though we make forays. We make forays into the 19th and 20th centuries from time to time around here, but there's just something about reading like how in Calmet's book he's just wrestling so much with the vampire as an issue of philosophical, spiritual, technological. People forget Dracula is a highly technological book. If you read that text, all that technology there is brand new. Blood transfusions and the cinematograph and the wax cylinder recorders that Dr. Seward uses to record. It's more science fiction as it is horror. So at any rate, I'm sure I'll be coming back to the vampire in due time. And again, if you want a copy of this wonderful text by Calmet, this is a 18th century edition, 1746, if I remember correctly. I'll be having it in my winter catalog for sale. But more on the vampire soon. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.